My phone buzzed 11 times before I even flipped it over. By the time I finally looked, the number had climbed past 100. All from the same person. All because of a decision I made in front of 300 people and a television camera. That decision would end up telling me exactly who my family really was. And it would take losing something to finally see it clearly. I want to start with Ryan. Because none of this makes sense without him. Tim. Ryan is my nephew, my late brother Paul's boy. Paul died of a heart attack when Ryan was 23, standing in the bay of the auto shop he'd spent 16 years building outside Millbrook. Ryan was there when it happened. He held his father's hand on that concrete floor until the ambulance arrived. And then, the very next morning, he went back to work. Because the shop had 3 cars on lifts and customers waiting on their breaks. That's who Ryan is. He kept that shop alive on nothing but stubbornness for 7 straight years. I'd stop by some Saturdays and find him there at 7 in the morning, bay doors already open, coffee going cold on the workbench because he'd forgotten about it 3 sips in. He never once asked me for money, not a dime. When his transmission lift broke down 2 winters back, he fixed it himself with salvage parts from a yard 2 towns over. Rather than take out another loan he couldn't afford, he was drowning slowly, and too proud to say so. And I watched it happen for years without fully understanding what I was looking at. My name is Harold Weller. I'm 68 years old. I spent 43 years as a heavy machinery engineer at Ironclad Manufacturing, the kind of place that used to be the backbone of this part of Ohio, back when a place like that still meant something to a whole town. I worked double shifts through 3 recessions. I missed 2 of my son's birthdays because an assembly line went down, and I was the only one who could get it running again by morning. For years I told myself the missed birthdays were the price of giving my family something solid, something they could stand on. I never once stopped to ask whether my son actually wanted something solid, or whether he just wanted his father sitting across the table from him on an ordinary Tuesday night. That's my honest fault in this story, and I own every bit of it. I built a fortress, and I called it love, and I never once checked to see whether anyone was actually living in it with me. My wife Diane passed away 12 years ago. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless. She used to say our son Grant had inherited her stubbornness and my silence, the worst possible combination 2 people could ever hand down to a child. I laughed when she said it, back then. I think about that sentence very differently now. On a gray Tuesday morning in March, Ironclad called to tell me they were retiring me with a gala. Not a sheet cake in the break room, a real event downtown, broadcast live on the regional business channel, because the company wanted to make a public statement about 4 decades of loyalty in an industry that rarely rewards loyalty anymore. I called Grant before I even called my own sister. I remember exactly what I said to him. They're putting me on television, son. 43 years. I want you there. There was a pause on the line I didn't like the shape of. Dad, we already booked Cabo. Erica's been planning this trip for 4 months. I told him the date was fixed, that I couldn't very well ask a company to move a live broadcast around one family's vacation. He said, and I'm quoting this exactly because I've replayed it in my head more times than I can count since. It's just another boring corporate dinner, Dad. You'll have 100 people there. You won't even notice we're gone. Erica got on the phone after that, not to apologize, but to ask if I could try to understand their perspective. I told her I understood it just fine. Then I hung up first, which almost never happens between a father and son, the father hanging up first. But I did it because I didn't trust my own voice to stay steady if I kept talking 1 more second. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call. The coffee maker clicked off behind me. The neighbor's dog barked twice out in the yard and then quit. I didn't cry. I just sat there at the table doing the math, quietly in my head, on how many missed dinners and missed games and missed ordinary evenings had led to a son who could call his own father's retirement boring. Without so much as a flinch in his voice, that's when I thought of Ryan. I called him on a Thursday evening. He was still at the shop, an impact wrench whining somewhere in the background. When I asked him to be my guest at the gala, he went quiet for a second, and then he said, "Uncle Harold, I'd be honored." A 29-year-old kid running himself straight into the ground, trying to save his dead father's shop. And he still had room left in him for a word like that. The night of the gala, Ryan showed up in a suit that didn't quite fit him right. Sleeves a half-inch too long, the kind of suit you buy off a clearance rack when you've got $400 saved up for a transmission part and nothing left over for tailoring. He didn't seem to care one bit. He stood beside me at the head table with his hands folded like he was sitting in church. And every few minutes he'd lean over and ask me quiet, genuine questions about people he didn't recognize, honestly curious, honestly proud just to be sitting there beside me. The ballroom held close to 300 people that night. Cameras from the regional network were set up in the back, red lights blinking steadily. I gave a short speech about the men and women I'd worked beside for over 4 decades, about a crane collapse we'd fixed by hand out in the rain back in the late 90s, about the quiet value of simply showing up, day after day, year after year, when nobody's watching and nobody's clapping. I looked over at the 2 empty seats where Grant and Erica should have been sitting. Then I looked at Ryan instead, and I kept right on talking. Then the company's CEO, a man named Douglas Ferris, walked up to the stage carrying a folder under his arm. And I could tell by the sudden shift in his voice that something was coming that nobody had told me about. "Harold has given this company 43 years, he said, looking out over the room. "So this year, for the very first time, Ironclad isn't just handing out a retirement watch and calling it a night. We asked Harold to name the one guest who represents his legacy best. The person who would still be standing beside him if this whole industry disappeared tomorrow. And he named his nephew, Ryan Weller. I hadn't been told what that meant going in. I found out along with everyone else, live on camera. Ryan runs an independent auto shop that's been fighting to survive for 7 years now, Ferris said. Tonight, in honor of Harold's service to this company, Ironclad Manufacturing is awarding Ryan a $900,000 legacy grant to expand that shop into a full-service center. The room went dead quiet for a second, and then it didn't. Ryan's hands were shaking right there on the tablecloth. He looked over at me like he needed my permission just to believe it was real. And all I could do was nod, because I couldn't quite get any words out either. The tears running down his face weren't the kind people perform for a camera. I've seen that kind plenty of times over the years. This wasn't it. This was a young man who had held his own dying father's hand on a cold concrete floor, finally hearing that all of it, every bit of that sacrifice, had actually meant something to somebody. We skipped the after-party entirely. Ryan and I ended up, about 2 hours later, sitting in a diner off the highway, the kind of place with a sticky laminated menu and coffee that never seems to run dry no matter how many cups you go through. We ordered pie because neither of us wanted a real meal. He kept saying, "I don't understand," over and over again. Not because he didn't understand the money itself, but because he genuinely couldn't process the fact that he'd been chosen. My phone sat face down on the table between us the whole time. At 9:45, it finally buzzed. I flipped it over without much thought and saw 11 missed calls, every one of them from Grant. I didn't call back right away. I wasn't ready yet. By 10:10, the count was up to 29. Ryan noticed something shift in my face and asked if everything was all right. I told him it would be. I wasn't lying to him exactly, but I wasn't entirely sure of it myself either. By 10:30, the count had climbed to 38, And underneath all those missed calls, the texts had started piling in fast, one right after another, the kind of rapid typing where you can practically feel the anger radiating through the screen before you've even opened the message. I finally sat down and read through all of them, around 11:15. Grant's first text said, "Dad, what the hell did you do?" The next one, sent 2 minutes later, said that Grant was supposed to be for family, for me. Then came one from Erica, a minute after that. "We saw the broadcast on the resort TV. You need to call the company right now and fix this." I sat there in that booth that smelled like fryer oil and old burnt coffee, staring at the word fix. Like the decision I'd made in front of 300 people and a live television camera was some kind of clerical error that a simple phone call could quietly undo. By the time we finally left that diner, close to midnight, the count on my phone sat at 112 missed calls and messages combined. I hadn't answered a single one of them. I want to be completely honest with you about something. I wasn't furious, not in that moment. I'd imagined, somewhere in the back of my mind over the years, there's some version of myself finally shouting into a phone, saying everything I'd swallowed down for decades. That is simply not what happened that night. What I actually felt, staring at that growing number on my screen, was something a great deal quieter and colder settling into place inside my chest, like a door easing shut somewhere without ever needing to slam. I called Grant back the very next morning at 8 o'clock sharp, because I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of ever saying later that I'd dodged him. He picked up before the first ring had even finished. "Dad, you have to call Ferris. Tell him it was a mistake. That grant money was supposed to come to me eventually anyway. That's basically my own inheritance, and you just handed the whole thing over to Ryan on live television." "It's not a mistake, Grant," I told him. "You're punishing us for going on one single trip," he said. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I hadn't punished anyone at all. I'd simply answered a question the company had put directly in front of me that night. "Who represents your legacy?" And I had answered it as honestly as I knew how. Nobody had forced him to book a trip to Cabo over his own father's retirement. Nobody had told Erica to call it just another boring corporate dinner. They had made their choice, and Ryan had made a different one entirely. And the distance between those two choices was the whole answer, right there. "So that's it," he said, his voice going flat and cold. "You're choosing him over your own son." "I'm not choosing him over you, Grant," I said quietly. "I chose the person who actually showed up. You chose not to be one of the options in the first place." He hung up on me that time, without another word. I let him. 3 weeks later, my attorney, a woman named Diane Marsh, who had handled my late wife's estate and my own affairs for well over a decade, called to ask whether I wanted to revisit my will in light of everything that had happened. Truth be told, I'd already been sitting with that exact question for days. Grant had never once needed anything from me that he didn't already get without asking twice. His mother and I paid for his college outright. We covered his entire wedding. We co-signed the loan on his very first house. Ryan, on the other hand, had never asked me for a single thing in his whole life, and he'd lost his own father on a concrete floor at 23 years old, and kept right on working the next morning anyway. I didn't rewrite the whole will out of spite, and I want to be very clear about that part, because spite was never the engine driving any of this. I simply moved the family cabin up on the lake, the same one Diane and I had bought the year Grant was born, the one he hadn't so much as visited in 6 years, into a trust naming Ryan as caretaker, with a clear stipulation that it stay in the family for gatherings and holidays, open to whoever wanted to use it. It wasn't locked away from Grant entirely. It was simply no longer his to quietly inherit and sell off, which I'd since learned from a mutual friend had been his plan for that cabin all along. Grant found out about the cabin from Diane's office, not from me directly. 4 months after the gala. He called me one evening, just once. I let it go to voicemail. Later, when I finally sat down and listened to it, his voice wasn't angry this time at all. It sounded smaller somehow. He said he honestly didn't understand how things had gotten to this particular point between the two of us. And if I'm being completely honest with you, I think that was the first truly honest thing my son had said to me in years. I didn't call him back that night either. I sat out on my porch instead, with a cup of coffee slowly going cold on the little table beside me, the exact same way Ryan's always does at the shop. And I thought about how strange it is that the people who end up costing you the least in this life are so very often the ones who give you the most in return. Ryan's shop reopened that September under a brand new name, Weller & Son Automotive. That was entirely his idea, not mine. A small, stubborn tribute to a father who never got to see it finished with his own eyes. Ryan put my name on a plaque right by the front door. Not because I ever asked him to, but because he said, in his own quiet way, that the whole story simply didn't make sense without both of us written into it somewhere. I go by most Saturdays now, same as always. He still forgets his coffee sitting out on the workbench, going cold. Some things just don't change, and I've come to be genuinely grateful for that particular one. Grant and I do talk sometimes these days. Not often and not easily, not yet. I honestly don't know if the two of us will ever get all the way back to what we once were. And at some point, I simply stopped waiting around for some perfect moment that fixes everything at once, because I don't believe that moment actually exists out there for anyone. What I have instead is something a good deal quieter than reconciliation. I know exactly who shows up for me now, without having to guess or hope or wonder anymore, and there is a strange, steady kind of peace to be found in that, even on the nights when it still aches a little around the edges. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to do one simple thing before you go. Think about who actually shows up in your own life, not who's supposed to, not who you wish would, but who genuinely does, again and again, without ever being asked. Tell that person what they mean to you. Don't wait around for a stage and a camera to finally say it out loud. If this story moved you, hit like, drop a comment about the part that stayed with you, and subscribe to Aftermath of Tales so you never miss the next one. Your support keeps these stories coming, so share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you next time.